co-chair of the Emergency Department of Emergency Medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin, as well as the director of the Injury Research Center. I should point out that Steve is distinguished in many areas. And those who've been around for a while know that Steve is the inaugural chairman of the Department of Medicine, of Emergency Medicine at Medical College. I remember, Steve remembers that section was a part of surgery, and Steve was very instrumental in making developing that department. So just a little bit about Steve. He got his BA up here at the PW Milwaukee, Medical College, at the medical school at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and an MPH from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and Hygiene. He did his rotating internship at Grover's Hospital in the Canal Zone, Panama. As I mentioned, he is the professor and chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine since 1998. As stated, since 1998, and since 2001, director of the Injury Research Center. He's also the director of the Global Health Pathway at MCW. Steve also is on the faculty at the Zilber School of Public Health, as well as the graduate school. Steve has had one award, recognized one from this organization back in 2000, when he was awarded the President's Award from the Kinetic of Medicine. He has a number of memberships in professional organizations. One of them to put up for certain is at Institute of Medicine, as well as being a Johns Hopkins Scholar. Steve, in terms of his comments tonight, as you see here with respect to gun violence, since 2013, he's been co-chair of the advisory board, National Medical Council on Gun Violence. And Steve has given a number of talks on locally, national, and international respect to gun violence. And so this evening, he's going to be talking about an area where he has a lot of experience and has done some research. And the thing I mentioned to Steve earlier is that he's talking at an appropriate time. Once again, the state of Wisconsin, the city of Milwaukee, has been recognized in the news for the consequence with respect to gun violence, and Steve may make some comments about that. But this evening, he is going to get the Distinguished Achievement Award, which is in recognition of outstanding contributions to the advancement of knowledge and practice of medicine by a Wisconsin physician. So once again, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Hargarten come and speak to us tonight regarding gun violence as it relates to Milwaukee and the Emergency Society. Steve? Sure.
Okay. I'm humbled by this recognition, and thank you. And I was looking at the list of previous individuals who had recognized, and again, truly humbled to be among the individuals recognized. Particular note, Charlie Abrahamian, who is a trauma surgeon from Black River Falls, who came to the medical college in the early 80s and was really one of the prime architects of the trauma center that we now know as Frederick. I do need to make sure that I correct a lot of those kind remarks, and they were very kind, but I was not the founding chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine. My former boss, Joe Darren, ought not to let you get away with that. Joe Darren was a trauma surgeon par excellence, and he and his diligence worked very hard to establish the department. I was honored to be the second chair, so I want people to know that clearly. I also want to recognize my wife Janice, who's here tonight, and she's put up with me and with doing some unorthodox research such as gun violence. So I want to thank her for her keeping me encouraged to pursue this area that fortunately or unfortunately continues to be a vexing problem in our society. So I've prepared a 2.5-hour presentation. I hope you're all set and ready to go, because this is a vexing issue, and deserves adequate time, but I'm going to condense my comments and hopefully I have time for questions. I really welcome this. I was reflecting on the fact that this society, this academy has been meeting since 1886. And I think this is going to be pulled into my comments as part of my attempt, and I want to really get your, I want to pull you into my thinking as framing gun violence as a biosocial disease. Just take a seat, Mr. Byrne, you're acting as if you're the only one who's been shot. So this is the dark humor of emergency medicine. We are dealing with gunshot wounds and freighted, unfortunately, children's daily, every other day, on weekends, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time. So how do we get our hands around this presenting problem that spans ages, ethnic groups, and really want to see if we can get a better understanding as a result of that. So the disease model really hasn't been around that long. You think about Koch's postulates were developed when this academy was started in 1886. It was really during the 1870s, 1880s that Koch was really developing the disease definition. Before that, it was largely considered something that befell you and you were unfortunately sick because you were of the wrong religion, you were not thinking properly, or you were poor and subject to poor housing. The disease process and the model that Koch and obviously others advanced was that there's a cause, there's an etiology, and that results in a predictable pathogenesis of mechanisms for its development into a disease. There's structural alterations which are induced in cells and organs that results in morphological changes, resulting in clinical presentations and functional consequences of the morphological changes. That's in page 4 of our pathophysiology textbook that we all learned in medical school. Imagine I went back to the pathophysiology and actually looked it up. There's the disease definition. Think about this. I think most of you know the real meaning of malaria. It's Italian for bad air. That's what they thought was malaria. Back in the 1880s, now it's just bad air. And now we know it's a disease. It's got an agent, parasite, mechanism for its to reduce cellular damage, organ disruption, and clinical manifestations. And by understanding it as a disease, we've got a set of approaches that we don't normally have. If we thought it was bad air, that's all we would be trying to do is trying to combat bad air. And now we look at the parasites, see if we get a vaccine. We look at the mosquitoes, see if we can make it sterile. We look at the environment for the water, where they breed, and we maybe put a net around a sleeping child. That's the benefit of understanding it as a disease. Most people would say, oh, this is a terrible accident. I look at this as a biosocial disease, car violence. It's a bad event that results in a kinetic energy exchange between the driver and the energy that's released when it goes into concrete at 60 miles an hour. And many of us have been in car crashes and get that energy release resulting in a head injury, contusion, or fracture. So the disease model strategies start to help us sort out maybe some strategies that we hadn't thought about. So if we look at a host of 5-year-old or a 23-year-old medical student, the agent is a biological agent for the 5-year-old and a physical agent for the 22-year-old medical student. The vehicle is the mosquito or the car. They're both in common environments. Now think about that, how we've applied that to motor vehicles, motor vehicle crashes. First of all, we had to reframe it. So accident is a makeshift concept with a hodgepodge of legal, medical, and statistical overtones. Hence, I suggest that the word be discarded in scientific discussion. This is the Milwaukee Academy of Medicine. It's been advancing scientific discussions for decades. This is a science discussion about gun violence. The definition of injury with a disease model is that it's physical damage due to the transfer of energy. In this case, this physical agent is kinetic energy, house fires, thermal energy, chemical energy, opioids, heroin, acetaminophen, causing chemical injury, electricity, radiation, or the absence of essentials such as oxygen and heat. Think about the fact that the Centers for Disease Control, which was started in the 1940s to examine malaria as a disease, only recently, in the early 90s, established the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. It's pretty late in the history of CDC that they're now wanting to recognize this as a disease. So instead of calling this a terrible accident, we describe it in better terms. It's a car crash resulting in damage to the individual driving it. Can anybody tell me what this interior is? Which car? Given the subject matter that we're talking about, this is the Corvair. Think about the inside of this car. It's a hostile environment. It's got knobs, and it's got these non-energy absorbing structures. It's got a spear that if you crash, you're going to get crushed. What happened in the 1960s when the Corvair was introduced? By the way, the Corvair was introduced because Porsche was made in 1959. General Motors wanted the rear engine model, so they made the Corvair. Yes, Paul?
My mom had one of those, and I can tell you, I never had so much fun as driving.
I share with you how much fun it was because I drove. Some of you know George Collentine, this burn surgeon here in this community. He and myself and my son took the joyride with his 1968 Corvair, which was a little safer than the earlier models. That's right. Very good. And so what happened during that time? During that time, when the defect of the car's design became known, the car defect was if you're driving and you swerve, the wheels buckle, you lose control, you get thrown out of the car because there's no seat belts and you die. Ernie Kovacs, the famous comedian, died in a Corvair-related crash. General Motors' response to the inquiry about these deaths: drive more carefully. Defensive driving courses came up. Answer, maybe that's not enough. Fix the car. And Corvair eventually went away. Unsafe at any speed came in 1965. And now we have a whole system of addressing this biosocial disease burden that afflicted us for years. Many of you may remember that the newspapers were reporting we had 10 crash deaths over the weekend. Over Labor Day, we had 20 crash deaths in Wisconsin. And this is steadily improved. Driver education, drunk driving laws, better car designs, better roadways. Think about the roadway designs we have now. So that disease model gave us benefits to strategize about a few more things. We think about the fact that injuries, if they're, as you frame it as a disease, they're predictable. It's predictable that a child would run in front of a car. What do you think those engineers were thinking when they put these guys on top of the hood? They're not thinking that this may be an additional injury mechanism. So there was a shift with the Society of Automotive Engineers to shift the design of cars in a way that made them safer. And we paid dividends. We've had huge benefits from this approach. So many of us are thinking, apply this to gun violence and see if we can start to make some headway in our understanding of it. You think about this disease burden, the etiological agent is the kinetic energy from the bullet. The vehicle is the gun. There are high-risk groups like there are for other diseases. You've got young black males, older white males, high-risk environments, urban centers, and rural areas. It's disappointing that a judge in our community says, guns don't kill people, people kill people. That's not science. The kinetic energy delivered by the bullet is what kills people. That's science. I think that's where this framing is so helpful to get everyone on the same scientific page, if you will, for better understanding how we can get our hands around it. So, placing this, and by the way, this is not something that many of us have just started thinking about. This is actually in Chapter 9 of your pathophysiology text. The physical agents of disease, kinetic energy. So by framing this as a biosocial disease, perhaps we can get some strategies. I look at this as the viruses, the bacteria that are infecting our patients. And they come in various sizes and shapes that deliver varying degrees, varying amounts of kinetic energy. We know that if this hits you in the leg, a 22 caliber, it's going to have a different effect than the 44 Magnum. And if a 44 Magnum hits you in the chest, it's going to predictably have more damage. Just like, again, we understand that certain infectious agents cause different injuries. Classic entrance wound of a bullet entering into the body. I say that this is a lead infiltrate. I know I'm stretching some of this, but I think it really is helpful to frame this. And has been discussed in months and months lately, is that we need to pull in physician leaders to be thinking about this as a disease burden and rightfully start to investigate it as it were, as any other disease. So this is our science, wound ballistics. Many ask, well, where's the laboratory for this disease? Actually, the laboratory in two places. One is the crime lab downtown in Levington, Lapham. I was there. That's where they test the ballistics of a bullet that came from a crime gun. But we also have an extraordinary resource at the Medical College of Wisconsin's crash lab on the VA grounds. They've been actually investigating this disease, car violence in particular, for decades. Just like we would investigate any other disease. Frank Pintar and his colleagues are the laboratory leaders in this disease process. And we took their technology of high-speed video camera, and the high-speed video camera is our microscope of this disease, because we can now understand the dynamics of a crash or bullet entering somebody's body by slowing it down by this high-speed photography, and understand that wound ballistics, which is now our way to describe this disease, is largely affected with location, size, and shape of the temporary cavity, depend on the amount of kinetic energy lost by the bullet in its path through tissue. That's really the definition, and this came from De Maio, who was a medical examiner in San Antonio for years. So this is our description of this disease, of pathogenesis, and by understanding this, we may be able to, and in fact we do, the surgeons by better understanding this, make better decisions about perhaps leaving this liver alone and not operating on it because it didn't strike any other anatomical organs. By understanding that, we maybe have non-operative management. In this other case, another case where if the bullet crashes into a bone and there's fragments, we understand that perhaps the bone's energy absorption may exceed its tissue strength, resulting in a fracture. So by understanding this, we take care of patients in a better way and perhaps have a larger effect on patients as a whole. So I just wanted to summarize this, and here's that case where when we saw this case and we saw the fragmentation of the bullet, we didn't really realize that the bullet directly hit the femur. Didn't look like there was a fracture, and indeed there was an occult fracture that we missed. So better understanding this helps us take care of patients better. And so I wanted to pull us in by understanding this, and framing this as a disease, our roles as physicians, other members of the healthcare team, improve patient care. And as I said, this is a good example of that. By understanding this, we start shifting, as physicians normally do, towards the agent of disease and the vehicle that carries it. It naturally has us look at, these are the vehicles. This is a Glock 9. If you're pulled over by the sheriff for speeding, you'll note that he's carrying, or she's carrying, a Glock. It's their favored semi-automatic pistol. This is an assault weapon that was banned by the Clinton administration in 1994. It has characteristics of assault weapon. It's got a barrel shroud, a threaded barrel tip for the silencer, so that your business meetings are very quiet and well controlled. It has a high capacity magazine. Clinton administration wanted to ban these. I went with Ed Quedman to the gun show in Las Vegas in 1995, a year after this was banned, and the same company had retooled and made the same weapon except with no barrel shroud, no threaded barrel tip, a smaller magazine. The problem was that those aren't the problem guns. What we found in Milwaukee, in one of the few studies that identified the most common types of guns associated with homicides and suicides in a defined geographic area, it was this little guy, 25 caliber Raven MP. It's a piece of junk. I call it the Pinto of handguns. And it's a distinctive barrel tip. When you look at the barrel down, it has a distinctive design. And I was at Washington High School a number of years ago, and I showed them the picture of the Raven. I said, how many of you know this gun? 3 kids shot up their hands and said, yeah, that's a Raven. Mm-hmm. When I was in high school, I knew that when a car was driving down the road, oh, that's a DeSoto, that's a Rainbow. I got that because they were distinctive. Your kids know the barrel of this piece of junk. It was the single most commonly identified handgun linked with homicides and suicides in Milwaukee in the 90s. We were the first to be able to describe that by methodically getting information from the medical examiners, the coroner, and the police, and the crime lab. So by knowing this, we started thinking, well, maybe this isn't a good product to be going around. And then when I've told various people about the fact that we didn't see assault weapons linked with bad outcomes, you wonder if we're misapplying our policies by not zeroing in on the ones linked with bad outcomes. Again, focusing on the vehicle and the access to lethal amounts of kinetic energy. This is a gun that we found, by the way, the crime lab in Milwaukee and its firearm division, it is an unbelievable resource. They have over 3,000 guns in their collection. It is so interesting. And we were talking about guns and access to lethal amounts of kinetic energy, and this one was brought to my attention. This is a Fox carbine, was made in the 1970s. Take a look at this section right here. Is a grip safety. You have to push in the grip safety in order to be able to pull the trigger. That's on 45 caliber pistols. The 1911 Browning was famous for that. But it's got this. It's a combination lock. You have a depressed teenager. The story is the 2 teenagers are riding their ATV in northern Wisconsin. They crash. That one teenager thinks his buddy was killed, goes home, grabs his dad's shotgun, and blows his brains out. If he can't get access to the kinetic energy, he'd grab a bottle of amoxicillin or Tylenol, and we in emergency medicine, as Tom well knows, we can fix that because we've got hours for that pathogenesis to be occurring. With that release of kinetic energy, it's over. So strategizing about that accessing this product by a despondent teenager, perhaps we should do a better job of reducing access to authorized users. How many saw Skyfall? So John, what happened when James Bond got Q, when Q came to give him his toy for the movie, what did he give him? Put you on the spot here, sorry.
Yeah, no.
Q gave him a gun.
But it only responded to him.
Correct. So what happened? The bad guy took his gun and James Bond said, I don't think it's going to be much use to you. And sure enough, he tried to kill him and it didn't. And then he got devoured by some lizard or something. That kind of gun is now available. The Germans are making it. It's a German company called Armitex. Think about that. Think about that strategy. A despondent teenager, we just were talking about this. Regularly despondent teenagers get access to somebody else's firearm and releases the energy. If they can't find that energy in the gun, they may go to some other methodologies. Again, the case fatality ratio is lower than with firearms. And we know that with suicides, it is the highest case fatality ratio method. So fixing the gun, like fixing the car, has independent merit while we're trying to do other things to reduce the despondency that does arise in teenagers or older adults by getting to therapy in a quick and easy, a way that can help them and transition them through this difficult phase. So it's just an example that I wanted to share with you that it helps us, at least helps me think about this and think about the opportunities that we have for intervention. So just to finalize my formal comments and open it up for questions is I think we benefit from framing gun violence as a biosocial disease. It's biological, it affects patients, we see that every day, unfortunately. It's social because of the nature of the fact that this product has a social fabric within our society. It's produced by individuals, companies, and we have a social environment in which there may be a support or not support for individuals. That if we understand this, we can optimize outcomes after the release of the kinetic energy, as I've outlined just briefly to you. But in some cases, in suicide in particular, if you attempt suicide with a firearm and you're successfully releasing that energy, there's not much time for intervention. We do not see unsuccessful gunshot wounds from suicide to ever come to the emergency department. So we need to do secondary prevention and primary prevention. Collaborate to identify those primary prevention strategies. Dispel myths. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. That's not science. One of my favorite cowboy movies is Shane. Remember that bar scene with Shane, Jack Palance? I mean, he's the best bad guy you'll ever see in a film. And there's Alan Ladd, and what does he do? He just dispenses with the kinetic energy, and Jack Palance goes across the room. Well, that's just physically impossible. It doesn't happen. So this disease has got mythologies and politics linked to it that are, again, similar to the kinds of politics that have been part of disease processes over the centuries. Most recently, HIV was politically embroiled in the 80s until the science got fully understood. And we're right in the middle of this, right, with this particular biosocial disease. And so we're obligated to advance science and educate leaders of civil society about what we can do about this vexing biosocial disease burden. As I was saying earlier, if we don't get this right, cities are going to continue to suffer. I was just in Baltimore, and it's a city that's been terribly damaged by the recent events. Milwaukee is suffering this as well. There's a great book that Bill Campbell, who's chair of pharmacology and toxicology at the medical college, told me about. The book's called The Remedy. And it's a story of the work of Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur in advancing science in the 1870s and 80s, and we've paid dividends by better understanding of this. And hopefully, cities have benefited from that, from infectious diseases being controlled, and hopefully we'll get Milwaukee to be the safest city in the United States. So a ways away. So just a lasting quote that I find very important that comes from Ralph Nader, and when we finally get out of school and join the workforce, we're taught how to make a buck, how to make a difference. And I think one of the pleasures when we were talking about this at our table was hanging around young people, medical students and residents, and hopefully teaching them how to make a difference in their future careers. And hopefully we can see that in the coming years. So lead you with this, because we've got a long ways to go with reframing this as a disease process. Here's the judge says, punishment sends message with a kid playing with a product. It leads to a prison term. Is that the right approach? I wonder. So, questions, comments? Wanted to be brief. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk, Steve. Around suicide prevention, means reduction, there have been studies. We've got science that shows that decreases suicide. The Brady Bill in Washington, D.C., when that was enacted and they had gun control and there were fewer guns, suicide rates went down. We know suicides are higher in states that have lots of guns, like Wisconsin. How do we get the politics out of it? Because we have the science. Science has been here for some time around this. It's getting better, but how do we get the politics out of this?
Well, I think the first response, John, is that this is inherently political. For now, I think it is inherent upon us to recognize that we have to deal with these events and in advancing our understanding, recognize that there are ways in which we have to inform political leaders about how we're going to take care of this disease process. And recognizing there was politics, we had politics in trying to get seatbelts in cars. 1960, airbags were invented in the 1950s. The story is that the three automakers went to Nixon in 1968 and said, we don't want airbags in cars. And Nixon said, okay. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was started in 1968. Its first head was a physician, Bill Haddon, who advanced the science at that time. But the politics of car crashes didn't result until 1981 when Ford was sued for not having airbags in cars. Suddenly, airbags in cars. The Iacocca comes on and starts advertising, we want you to have airbags in cars. So the politics of car crash injury prevention and control was played out 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I sometimes think that we're in the 50s and 60s with this biosocial disease burden. So by steadily talking about this as a disease process, I've had diverse audiences not have any difficulty with this approach. And I think we need to do more about that approach than we've had, educating the media when possible to frame this as a biosocial disease burden. So we've got a ways to go. There's no easy solution, but we have to continuously advance this in the science that we know helps us better understand other diseases. Yes?
I was in Connecticut back 3 weeks ago, and coincident with my visit was the opening of the newest museum in the state.
Yes.
By Ralph Nader.
Yes.
Called the Museum of Tort Law, in which they have a purveyor, really. But the point is that part of what drove this, and you mentioned it a second ago, is tort law, which pushed the decision making. And as physicians, we tend to be skeptical of tort law because we think of it as something that needs to be fixed because of malpractice. But a large part of the advance in the car safety issue came from lawsuits.
Yes, that's right.
And so, obviously gun violence has an impediment because of the Second Amendment, but it is encouraging that the state, the courts in this state recently ruled, as you know, against a gun dealer and providing guns to a minor. And just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, the Second Court of Appeals upheld Connecticut and New York State's rules about, unfortunately, the wrong target, which is the high velocity, high magazine guns. But we should probably need to be more supportive of our attorney colleagues and helping them advance some of this through the legal system.
The history of injury prevention is that tension and advancing of science and tension that goes on, and you've summarized it with car crashes, but other products have been implicated as that as well. And I'd love to go to that museum. I just read about it too, and I'd love to see it. It's a very interesting part of trying to manage this kinetic energy. And now you think of methodologies, to your comment, John, is the Golden Gate Bridge as a methodology for suicide, and how they've struggled with putting a net there and recognize, oh, I can't use that methodology, I need to go somewhere else. So it's interesting how political that was to get that net in the bridge. Yes, sir.
I have some difficulty with the analogy to car injuries. The car is designed to get you from A to B. Okay, it's a means of transportation. The gun is designed to kill you. I mean, to cause bodily injury. That's the design of it, the purpose of it. So to make this analogy, I think there's some disconnect here. Everybody buys into you want a safer transportation, but it's very difficult to say you want to kill somebody, you want to have a safer way of killing somebody.
It's interesting, and I that's why I wanted this discussion and welcome this. With methodologies being variable, I believe it's Norway that cars are increasingly used to commit suicide because they have access to kinetic energy in lethal amounts. So while the product's design is to release kinetic energy in a focused, penetrating way, it doesn't preclude us from applying those principles of, in this case, perhaps primarily preventing the release of that energy by unauthorized individuals. 14-year-olds. Having access to a car, you need a key. Access to lethal amounts of kinetic energy with a gun. We just now know that James Bond's got access to that technology, and maybe others should. So I think it's still very valuable for us to frame it so that we can have these discussions to understand limits and potential. And that wasn't discussion for cars in the 1950s. It was leave it alone. It's my car, I want to go from A to B, and don't tell me how to do it. And now things have changed considerably for the better. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the talk. I was just thinking, things haven't changed a whole lot since you authored the white paper for the Milwaukee Academy of Medicine over 20 years ago. And I don't know if anyone heard, there was an interview on National Public Radio a week ago with former Congressman Dickey from Arkansas, who wrote the bill preventing any federal funding on gun violence research that might lead to gun control. And now, over 20 years later, he says he regrets that he wrote the bill in that way because he sees that there hasn't really been much research that's been funded federally looking at the questions. Of course, now with the school shootings in Oregon, Newtown, we just don't seem to have made much progress knowledge-wise, and certainly not society-wise in the last 20 years. Am I wrong?
No, you're spot on with that that story that I just read myself, and I remember being in director's home when this was being discussed in the 90s. You think about a vexing disease that is subject to such external pressure to not study it, but think about HIV in the 80s, where it took several years before there was recognition and then some research, and then a full court press. I don't have that right, but in the late 80s, 90s is when the funding really came about and we benefited. And it's unfortunate that this vexing biosocial disease burden has been mired in debates over the ownership of the product as opposed to identifying ways in which we can reduce this burden in our communities. And I think we've lost 20 years of research as a result of that. And hopefully that'll start to pick up. Yes, Paul?
Talking about comorbidities, how about the whole issue of mental illness with, especially the mass murders that have happened?
And John Lerman is going to correct me since he's the expert in mental illness who's sitting behind you there, Paul. Most mentally ill people are not violent. The studies are clear. It's not a major cause of violence, though there's a subset that do have and do commit some of these atrocities, but by and large, mentally ill patients are not the risk groups. Angry young men.
Has good research been done in that regard?
Yes, actually.
With guns in mass murders?
Sure.
School shootings?
Sure. I think, again, that's not been fully analyzed like I think one should understand the scope and nature of their distorted thinking or their illness, and that's something I'm not going to be able to answer in detail. And maybe, John, you want to comment on that, but I think it's very, very complex. And what's I find, most recently we were talking about this, is we have a investigation of this outbreak of kinetic energy at the Sikh temple. It's not investigated as a public health outbreak. You think about the Ebola outbreak, and you have a full court press of investigating how to control it. Nobody investigated that Sikh shooting with the same principles of public health, find out the individual who committed this event, what was that person like? I don't think he was mentally ill, but you might want to comment.
I'd say by far most people with mental illness are actually much more prone to be victims of violence than to be violent perpetrators. There is a small, when I was in medical school, they taught us that people with mental illness are not at an increased risk. That's not true anymore. We now know that there's a small group, couple very specific diagnostic categories that are at higher risk for violence that are playing a role in some of these. You know, I think we've been benefiting in mental health field because of the politics of recent, because of these shootings. It brought attention to mental health care, which is also the tort law is affecting mental health care. In the state of Massachusetts has a child psychiatry access project that covers the whole state that resulted from major suits against the state for inadequate mental health care. And so we're benefiting from the attention, but the attention needs to go in two directions. We do need much improved mental health care across our community, but we also need to address the gun safety issues that Steve's talking about. And I think if we had a two-pronged approach, we'd be in a much, much better place today.
Carl?
Is there an opportunity for dialogue with the NRA in a political sense?
So just take a note as to who first brought up the NRA. I didn't. The NRA was established in 1871 for two reasons. Marksmanship, because the Union Army was so terrible compared to the Confederates. Two, safety. When I've spoken to NRA members, this is very understandable. I have had, when I formed the Firearm Injury Center back in the late 90s, there were 4 lifetime members of the NRA, several of them faculty members at the medical college. Terrific, terrific resources. So, there's a very instructive book called Getting to Yes. Making the NRA is a trade union for users. I think that's fine. Sportsmen want to have this product, that's great. My target for this is the gun manufacturers. They make the product. Sturm Ruger. Ruger was a brilliant metallurgist. 1949, started a company to make guns. He had the brilliant idea of when making the Colt Peacemaker, 1951, 50, right down to the design flaw. Because the Colt Peacemaker, if you have the bullet in the chamber and it's opposite, it's right with the firing pin, and the hammer is right there and it's against the firing pin, and you drop it, it'll go off. Colt knew that. Ruger knew that. There was no agency that says you can't make the gun that way, because there's no federal agency overseeing the safety features of a firearm, because the Consumer Product Safety Commission was not permitted to do that in 1971. Sherman Ruger knew that, sold 1.5 million of these guns, all with a design flaw. And in the 70s, they started getting sued, and they changed the design. But it's the manufacturers that are now thinking of personalized guns, and the manufacturers are seeking it. So I'm finding the NRA is making them irrelevant is maybe a little too strong, but they're not in this. They're not public health. They're not disease specialists. Yes.
What I find a real puzzle is that prior to around 30 years ago, there was a general society consensus that there needed to be gun regulation. When I was growing up in New York City, it had the most rigid gun control rules of any place, and there was general consensus. So what I can't quite figure out is what's changed in society about this issue that the court, they have to be fought in the courts and everything, and there are so many people who think that their guns are being taken away from. There is no history of guns being removed from anybody in the United States since the beginning of the country. So where this myth came from, it's hard for me to understand.
Well, ammunition has been compromised. There's been a huge buy-up by the government of ammunition in certain models.
I've not heard that. I don't know.
That's
but,
true. That's true.
I did say that we were going to talk for 2.5 hours. I think this is a huge subject, but it's just very, very complex. It's very, very complex. So, yes, sir.
The discussion is absolutely fantastic. I've enjoyed it very much. I'd like to know your comment, though, on the product, what you call the gun, is a defensive thing, and well. And I'd like to know what you think about what Sheriff Clark says here in the Milwaukee area that says, have your own gun, protect yourself. What is your comment on that?
So, I think people make choices, and they make decisions about how they wish to have control of their environment, and some people elect to have a product in their home that provides them with protection.
How do you address the issue then in your disease process? For instance, they use the mosquito here. Well, what do we do to treat malaria? We kill the mosquito.
Right. In this case, I would attenuate the vehicle. Attenuating it, I mean, in that sense, that reduces access to unauthorized users. So one of the studies that did show a demonstration of decreased suicides and access to unauthorized means was a simple lockbox. So you have the firearm in your home for home protection, and it's in a lockbox, and you do this, and you have access immediately. That's
not what's killing people right now in Chicago. It's black on black, 28 kids every weekend shot.
Sure.
How is this going to change with your analysis here?
But Steve, you're forgetting the epidemiology. If you buy a gun, you're more likely to die from gun violence, and you want to protect yourself and your family from a violent attack.
That may be true.
Right, that's
I don't know the statistics, but that's the argument that our Sheriff Clark is using right now.
It's bad science. That's
Well, what do you call it, science, or was it realism as well? People have to
I
make
think
that
this is
decision.
where we have to advance our understanding of this in the most rigorous, thoughtful way.
Yeah.
So complicated.
I think we have one last question.
Okay.
Let me ask what
I'm going to adjudicate who's going to have
that
one.
one. She has it.
So
I have
The president's prerogative.
So, it appears to me that the vocal minority very vocal minority of Second Amendment rights activists who prioritize that amendment kind of above all others are the political reason why all of these very sensible things that we're talking about that could mitigate all the bad, or some of the bad decisions that get made, don't ever get any traction. So, and probably most of them aren't actually in the NRA, they're their own thing. Have you ever had the opportunity to talk to Second Amendment rights activists, and how do they respond to that model as a way to get past where they are?
Sure. I'm not a constitutional expert.
Me neither.
So the way I was framing it with, in fact, when I wrote about this with the concealed weapon carrying, is to have the policymakers give pause about what they are introducing into the community. Should they be able to carry the defective Sturm Ruger? In fact, I wrote about a case that happened in Arizona. The gun was discharged twice, unintentionally, killing an individual and wounding others. So I'm not advocating one way or the other for concealed weapon carrying or the right to carry. That's a different subject that I'm not well versed. But in the biosocial disease burden model, you really want to carry a Sturm Ruger that you're carrying it and it falls out, it's going to go off and kill somebody? My daughter? That kind of pulls it into public health in my world.
I was just curious whether that model would be able to get through to that.
So I think it does give pause. When I was talking to an individual who wanted to have that right to carry concealed weapon, I said, do you really want to carry a .32D Davis Derringer that has the same design flaw that the Sturm Ruger does? And you can carry it into a bar and pick up something that happened in Indianapolis a number of years ago, falls out, discharges it, and strikes 2 women. Do we really want Pintos in our community? I think that's where the discussion can get pretty granular and thoughtful, rather than the courts have adjudicated this. That's not my role at this stage as a physician trying to attack this biosocial disease burden. It's something that we can talk about in a different light, in a different way. Bullets are an interesting approach because Baltimore, at one point, the city health department shut down some ammunition dealers who were selling 1 or 2 bullets at a time on Friday night. It's a public health nuisance. So they framed it as a public health nuisance, and that's a public health approach intervention, no different than closing bathhouses in San Francisco in the early 80s. So I think that's where we can have some traction as leaders of civil society and leaders from biosocial disease burden. The constitutional issues are vexing and thorny and difficult to understand. That's not something I can understand. So thank you.
Thank you again, and we'll see everybody in November.